Several years, or possibly only a year, before Tiberius went to Rhodes, a ship sailed from the harbor of Alexandria, carrying an important traveler. A man in his middle 50s, with streaks of gray in his black hair, he stood in the stern of a ship until they were far out to sea, watching with peculiar interest the way in which the great lighthouse gradually disappeared below the waterline, until only the tip was visible, and then that too was gone. A never-failing source of interest to him was this constant proof that the surface of the sea was curved and the earth must be round. For this traveler was Strabo, the geographer. After his trip up the Nile with his friend the Roman governor, on which they had gone as far as the borders of Ethiopia, Strabo had returned to Alexandria to study in the library. There he had pored over the works of all the old Greek philosophers who had written of geography. Now, with many rolls of notes that he had made, and with his mind full of things that he had seen, Strabo was leaving Egypt for Rome. This was not his first visit to that city of the West. He had arrived in Rome for the first time in 44 B.C., the year that Julius Caesar had been murdered. Strabo was then a boy of 19, having been born the same year as Augustus. His birthplace was Amasia, a city in Pontus, not far from the border of Armenia. His parents, being wealthy and well able to do so, had sent their son to Rome, thinking, possibly, that a view of the West might round out his education. In Rome, young Strabo had studied with the sons of Cicero under the same tutor. There he had also first read Julius Caesar's book about his war in Gaul. Caesar's description of the wild country, the forest of Germany, the foggy island of Britain, may well have aroused Strabo's first interest in geography. Although he had begun his career by writing history, now, at 50, it was Strabo's ambition to make a geography of the world. "Why write another geography?" inquired someone to whom he had confided his purpose, someone perhaps on shipboard with whom he had fallen into conversation. "My excuse," said Strabo, "is that I believe I shall be able to make at least some small addition to what the others have said. The conquest of the Romans and the Parthians have added to our knowledge of the world, just as the campaigns of Alexander the Great did in earlier times. The Romans have opened the western parts of Europe, and the Parthians have increased our knowledge of the Scythes, who live in the northeast. Also, I believe you could not find another person among the old writers of geography who has traveled more than I." While in Alexandria, two of the Greek geographers which Strabo had studied were Herodotus and Eratosthenes. His final result changed their maps little. Herodotus had lived in Athens about 450 years ago at the time of Socrates. As a boy, Strabo remembered hearing Cicero always refer to Herodotus as the father of geography. Eratosthenes had lived about 250 years later. He had been the chief librarian at Alexandria. By measuring the length of the shadows thrown by the sun in different places on the earth, he had figured out for the first time the correct distance around the earth, as being about 25,000 miles. On his globe, Strabo showed all of the earth that he knew to be inhabited as an island in the shape of a soldier's cape. "We have learned by experience that the inhabited world is an island," he explained in discussing it with a group of fellow travelers, "because wherever it has been possible to reach the limits of the earth, sea has been found. And it is more than likely that that sea, which we call the Atlantic or outer ocean, is one in continuous." "In that case, do you think it possible to sail around the world?" asked someone. "I do, if the size of it were not such an obstacle," he replied. We might easily pass out through the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean and sail from Spain to India. Has it ever been tried? Yes, and those who undertook to sail round the globe turned back, they say, not because any continent stood in their way, but because of their want and loneliness. Yet, on the other hand, he continued, it is quite possible that in the temperate zone there may be 2 or even more inhabitable islands. Another continent, perhaps, like that of Atlantis, would you say? Asked someone. He was referring to the old familiar story of a long-lost continent which had been related by Plato, and which Plato had learned from the priests of Egypt when he studied there. Once, in most ancient days, according to a tradition handed down by those old Egyptian priests, there had been a continent in the Atlantic Ocean, west of Africa, known as Atlantis. But an upheaval had occurred in the bed of the ocean, and the continents had sunk completely and disappeared beneath the surface of the sea. Was the story true? Had such a continent existed? Had all the inhabitants perished, or did some of them escape? Was it a myth, or was it history? Those and other such questions kept the travelers on that ship in the Mediterranean speculating and surmising till the night was bright with stars. Strictly speaking, as a geographer, concluded Strabo, it is not my business to inquire whether or not there may be other inhabited continents. Strictly speaking, as a geographer, concluded Strabo, it is not my business to inquire whether or not there may be other inhabited continents. The object of a geographer is to describe known countries. Also, it would serve no purpose to be well acquainted with such distant places, especially if their inhabitants can neither injure nor benefit us by their commerce. And yet, Strabo had shown that he found much the same fascination in wondering about it that people today find in wondering whether other planets might be inhabited. What if, instead of turning north, thought Strabo late one afternoon as the ship was changing course, what if our captain should steer directly west, and we should go out through those Pillars of Hercules, and keep sailing on and on into the west, till we could go no further? Where would we land? What would we find? Where would they land? What would they find? Those were questions to which no one in Europe would have an answer for a long time to come.